Yeah, thanks everyone for attending. This is the SIG Autoscaling Karpenter SIG for Monday, the 24th of July, 2023. We have one proposed item on the agenda, walkthrough of the Karpenter V1 Beta 1 API and review of it. I think, Jonathan, are you taking the lead on this?
Yeah, I have a Google Doc that I'll just share in the chat. I figure we probably want to give a little bit of time for people to look over the doc, like walk through it. So 15 minutes maybe. That's unreasonable. Maybe too long, I don't know. Yeah.
Sure. I might pause the recording.
Okay.
Rather than just have dead space, but it's easier for me than trimming later. Is my lazy reasoning.
Yeah, portion of the way through. Okay, sounds good. Yeah. So yeah, this is the V1 Beta 1 Karpenter API proposal. This kind of continues some of the conversation that we were originally having about Karpenter API and kind of the overview that we gave, I guess, 2 weeks ago at this point. The top portion of this API proposal basically describes some of the onus behind why we think we should move to a V1 Beta 1 API and some of the laundry list of items that are captured in an issue. There's some details about the amount of bake time that we feel like we should give between, or that we've given between V1 Alpha 5 and V1 Beta 1, and how much time we should give between V1 Beta 1 and V1. But a lot of this is just kind of the background context. I think most of the interesting pieces that we probably want to discuss in this forum, one have to do with the naming. So the kind naming is something that we're talking about changing, primarily to just align around nodes, mainly because users are obviously more familiar with nodes and those that are introduced to the Karpenter project or CAS are just thinking about working with nodes. And so right now we have the concept of a provisioner, and we have the concept of an AWS node template, and we have the concept of a machine. We basically want to kind of align everything around nodes, aside from machine, which we still again kind of see as like an implementation detail for the management of the machine capacity that exists inside of a cloud provider. So biggest thing there is that we're thinking about renaming the provisioner to node pool, to describe kind of what it's actually doing, which is at the end of the day, its responsibility is to provision nodes for the user. And we felt like pool was more of, descriptive of kind of a heterogeneous state of nodes that would get provisioned, considering node pool basically describes, like the high level boundary for all the nodes that you can provision, and they're going to be quite heterogeneous being launched from that given node pool. And so that piece is there. Likewise, changing AWS node template, one to be not contain the word AWS inside of its naming. So we had originally thought about, or at least considered using node template as the naming, primarily because we just wanted to pull AWS out of the name and put it into the group. So the thought was that cloud providers can create their own disparate API groups, although I know that Ellis had mentioned in a comment down below at some point that we've kind of talked a little bit about it. We've had some ideas around can we align a single neutral API group similar to like storage class. But we had thought, okay, we can create, separate API groups for cloud providers. You have an AWS specific API group. You have a GCP specific API group. You've got an Azure specific API group. And then each one names their CRD node template. And then that's basically how you scope the GBK there. I think it was, we thought about it a little bit more. The word template, I think traditionally in at least in Kubernetes, the word template has kind of defined like a high level construct that's then responsible for provisioning a lower level construct. So like pod template spec is used within a deployment or within a stateful set. Job template spec is used within a cron job. These are all things that are, like a high level construct that's responsible. It's templatizing a lower level construct and is directly responsible for provisioning that thing. I think we like node class a little bit more just because of the interplay with storage class, and how storage class at least is responsible for basically defining the interface through which an external component is interfacing and provisioning, like as a side effect, storage. So there's obviously the CSI driver is responsible for interfacing with the storage class to provision a PV at the end of the day. I think likewise, we thought with Karpenter, at the end of the day, the cloud provider API is responsible for interfacing with this API surface, which we're describing as the node class, and that has the side effect of provisioning a node. The node template isn't necessarily defining the spec for the node. So I thought the interplay, at least we thought the interplay between like calling that template might be a little bit confusing, specifically because the configuration that exists inside the node template isn't static. It has some dynamicness to it. And also it's more of an interface for the cloud provider to talk or to figure out exactly how it should launch capacity, less about like how it should actually like go about creating a node. I'll stop there on just like kind naming if anyone has any high level comments or thoughts.
I think that the reasoning seems to make sense to me, particularly on the class versus template. Is there a question there?
Sorry if this is a silly question. Have these changes already been implemented, or are we talking?
No, this is part of the proposal. So right now we're in V1 Alpha 5, and V1 Alpha 5 within Karpenter.sh API group. So provisioner and machine exist in Karpenter.sh API group. So those are in V1 Alpha 5, and then we're in V1 Alpha 1 on the cloud provider specific side. So the AWS node template is in V1 Alpha 1, and we're promoting both of them to V1 Beta 1 as part of this like API proposal.
I see. Thank you.
I think the more interesting conversation is probably the API group naming. This is most likely the thing we probably need to spend the most time on and talk about and align on. Yeah, I don't know. I figure there'd be a lot of discussion here and some high level thoughts on. I think we've talked a little bit briefly, maybe a few weeks back, about aligning label naming and API group naming across CAS and Karpenter. And so there's kind of this open question about, I know CAS is mostly, at least right now, configures itself primarily through CLI arguments. And I know there's some proposals and thoughts around extending that into custom resources at maybe long term. But right now, the group naming, as far as I'm aware, basically just extends out to kind of like label group scoping. And obviously for Karpenter, most of its configuration is driven through custom resources. So we kind of naturally need a place for the custom resources to sit inside of a neutral API group. And so there's kind of a question long-term around what is that API group naming? I think we'd like to get away from Karpenter.sh and kind of move into like long-term a Kubernetes.io namespace that's shared across a CAS and Karpenter, but there's a question about what that should be named and how that should look. And yeah.
Even further, there was a question on like, do we need a KEP for this, or like how, like from a SIG perspective, like how would you proceed with entering the Kubernetes.io namespace?
I think even more broadly, right? Other than the naming, which is obviously an important decision and the process, what I'd like to think about is how do we envision the future of this namespace? I think there are a few things. To me, I think the ideal state would be if this is some sort of, let's say, auto-scaling standard, and then it doesn't, like, you have portability between different autoscalers, different platforms, and so on, as much as we can standardize it. And I think there are a few no-brainers, like I'm going to use the simplest example there is, which is the cluster autoscaler has save to evict annotation. Karpenter has, I think, do not evict, so that it's kind of reverse in terms of true false. But obviously it's conceptually exactly the same thing with exactly the same meaning. We could just have a name and just start supporting it everywhere and hope to make it a standard. I think broader question on the new, let's say, node pool, that old provisioner, is I think the cluster autoscaler and Karpenter sort of as projects have different scope. I would say Karpenter feels like an superset of cluster autoscaler. It's basically doing cluster autoscaler and then a bunch of other stuff that cluster autoscaler delegates to other things, like either cloud provider specific node pools or something like what's the name of the project? The cluster API, which, by the way, I think maybe it would be interesting to have cluster API in this specific discussion, because it feels like node pool and then machine deployment are like not super far away conceptually, but I don't feel like I'm an expert here. So it would be interesting to think what should be even the scope of this configuration. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just like literally making it up as I go. So I may be saying something very dumb, but you know, would it be possible to isolate some sort of shared API surface between cluster autoscaler and Karpenter and put this together? I think the node pool as a single entity is going to be challenging because it combines really two things. So how the nodes are configured, which is outside of the scope for cluster autoscaler, and then how the nodes are autoscaled, which is very much in scope. So things like, I think, deprovisioning strategy. I realized deprovisioning in Karpenter and then scale down in cluster autoscaler have their implementation differences, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's the same thing. I'm sure we could figure out some ways to make it at least somewhat portable. I don't know. I'm just kind of trying to make it up as I go. And also, I think it could be interesting to look from both sides. If there is interest in this group, I'm happy to prepare some sort of talk for one of the future meetings on cluster autoscaler APIs. But things like priority expander in cluster autoscaler isn't node pool config per se, but it's kind of related. It specifies preferences. I think Karpenter does it with weights on provisioners. Like that is an example of something where we could come up with a good way. It's essentially solving the same problem, whether it's an ordered list or a list of weights. It doesn't really matter. It's the same thing conceptually. So yeah, just my thoughts.
Yeah, you got me thinking when you brought up CAPI, which we have thought about a little bit, but I think is kind of, it's always harder to expand the scope of the conversation. But Karpenter absolutely kind of spans the concerns of like node lifecycle and node autoscaling. I think it was one of the reasons why I think just having chatted with Jonathan, we were a little uncomfortable about autoscaling.kubernetes.io, just since Karpenter does more than that. I do wonder if there's, like, you don't necessarily have to map a namespace to a specific SIG. Like multiple SIGs can, like, say for example, we were to choose the label like node lifecycle.kubernetes.io. That term makes sense from a cluster autoscaler perspective in terms of how it pertains to node lifecycle for protecting scale down. And it might also make sense for SIG cluster API or SIG cluster lifecycle, I guess, to also adopt that label for anything that it's doing around cluster lifecycle. So just kind of +1 to we should at least chat once with them and see if they're interested in pursuing this further. But I do think that there's maybe, like, given this kind of scoping question, there's maybe a label that makes sense for kind of both scopes, both the scaling scope, but also the other deprovisioning reasons, whether it's, you know, spot interruption or node upgrade or the various other, and you could even imagine like ASG or GKE's node pools integrating with this same label if we were able to standardize it around the Kubernetes domain.
Yeah, I'm +1 to that. I would love to have as many things standardized as possible on one thing. I think having 100 different APIs for the same thing is just a pain for the users. And if we can solve this, that's great. And the more kind of we can bring into this, that the more broad the standard, and if it works with other projects, that just shows it's a good design, I think. Yeah, I think my main point isn't really on the choice of the namespace. I'm not sure about the node specifically because there is, I'm sure like SIG node already has one, which I think is more for node runtime kind of things. I don't mind. I kind of would like to know what's already in there if it matches. I think compute one is nice. So I don't mind a broader name at all. I just meant, I think in terms of the APIs themselves, ideal end state, which may take us some time and maybe doesn't align with your beta timelines and so on, could be one where the APIs are actually covering both projects. Like they have some shared API that actually works in both. That I think would be great. I think basically just deciding on a namespace and throwing it like two sets of CRDs, one for cluster autoscaler, one for Karpenter into the same namespace doesn't really standardize anything. It's just like putting everything into one big box. But if we can find the overlap and come up with one API, that's I think the ideal state.
Yeah, I think the point of this discussion was mainly to serve as a jumping off point. I think like Maciek, you and I have been discussing a little bit. I think like obviously as an AI, we should take up like kind of building out a doc that describes some of these things. I definitely need more context into like some of the API surface forecasts. I have like a high level overview, but it would be interesting to discuss like the areas we can align. I know I saw some of the similarities, like safe to evict, obviously. Yeah, I think we've kind of come to the understanding that like if we do like when we decide to align these custom resources, or at least like the label namespaces across projects, it probably is a little ambitious to try and align them by V1 beta 1 timeframes. But I think we can work with the time that it's going to take. I think there's a question about like there was like an open question if we decide to do something like autoscaling.kubernetes.io or compute.kubernetes.io, do we need to open like a cap? Do we have to go through the full like enhancement review process? I don't know if anyone has context or is aware, but like, and how long these things might take.
If it's anything that that uses .kubernetes.io or .k8s.io, and it's not already in use, then yeah, we'll need to go through API review process. So it's not quite the same as KEP. There are documents on it. I think I had them open somewhere. Oh yeah, here we go.
And that would include more than the label name, but also the APIs that so as any API is introduced under that group name, a group name that is suffixed by kubernetes.io, it's subject to Kubernetes API review.
Yeah.
Did the cluster autoscaler.kubernetes.io group name, presumably that went through the same process a long time ago?
I think the process didn't exist back then. I think a lot of things, like the reason cluster autoscaler uses config maps and CRDs was CRDs were not around at that time, and a lot of cluster autoscaler APIs because it came in 1.5 and then a lot of stuff was different.
Yeah, I think there's probably a fair few things in the cluster autoscaler APIs that if the review process was the same as they are now, would be different.
So yeah, I'm pretty sure all the config maps would not fly today. I would like to have CRDs eventually, and this is actually a great opportunity to prioritize that. If there is a standardization, then that is a good motivation to do that.
I see two options, or maybe even different ways to do this, but one, it would be interesting to propose this new namespace. Like maybe we could try to agree on a whether it's a subdomain, like how all of these options, agree on the namespace where we would like to align cluster autoscaler and Karpenter and get that kind of nailed down. And then maybe as a secondary, like a fast follow to that, or as a first use case to vet it, would be to propose introducing Karpenter's APIs into that namespace. That and I'm curious to see how long that process would take. Like it definitely might get, like there's some kind of tricky timelines here, because introducing Karpenter's APIs into that namespace is very much like Karpenter. It is Karpenter joining the Kubernetes project in some sense. So there's maybe some sort of sequencing as per this process. We could maybe do it aspirationally and start the implementation and choose to productionize it or not, depending on that decision. And I guess the other piece would be to try to get the CAPI folks involved. But I would like to find a path where we can do this in like 1 to 2 months, if at all possible. Like if we were to, like, we want to get to 1.0 before the end of the year, like ideally around KubeCon-ish times. Not that we will try to launch KubeCon or anything, but that, just to throw a dart, like to target something like that for a 1.0. And we'll see what happens when the rubber meets the road. But do you think that's reasonable from like a process perspective? Do you think that we can come to alignment on what this label is, propose it to the community, kind of get agreement, and then move forward with an implementation in that time?
I'm not going to comment on the process side. I think guys more competent here. I am certainly not. So I'm just going to leave that one completely aside. I think I would prefer to follow the route of basically, starting with, basically, I think the shared namespace should be where shared APIs live, right? I think the current proposed APIs are very Karpenter specific and realistically aren't really something we can support in cluster autoscaler because of the whole, it doesn't really solve the same set of problems, right? It's the whole thing I mentioned earlier with different scope of the project. So I'd rather use a kind of shared official name group for the standardized API, right? Because then if we introduce the Karpenter API as the standard one, then first of all, we would have to deprecate it, I guess, at some point to actually move to a more, like one that is more supportable by CA as well. And also, it basically creates a scenario where it moves the responsibility to CA to migrate to this API and extend the scope of the project, which I think for many reasons is unlikely to happen, right? We already have like 30 plus integrations based on the existing node groups. I don't think all of those, like realistically, we're not going to get all of those cloud providers to change their implementations, I imagine.
I'm not sure I quite agree. I think like the point of the namespace is that it's kind of arbitrarily large as long as you don't have naming or concept conflict. And so I think if we, like say for example, we were able to find an API that was shareable between the projects, that would absolutely make sense to live in the namespace. But even if we ended up with different APIs with slightly, different concepts, I still think they kind of make sense in the same namespace. They are conceptually tackling the same scope. Like you almost have two namespaces here. One is like the API group, and then the other namespace is the literal name of the kind. So I think that there's some benefits to kind of aspirationally moving into this namespace for our APIs, and then if it makes sense that CAS were to use, say for example, we put a replicas field into the node pool, and we've talked about this, as a way to do manual provisioning. Suddenly that would make the Karpenter node pool API compatible with CAS, and you could write a Karpenter provider for it. Not to say that this path will necessarily happen, and it's kind of unclear what the benefits would be. It's like you want to use CAS to scale your Karpenter for the node lifecycle and CAS for the scaling, or Karpenter for the lifecycle and Karpenter for the scaling. There's kind of, but that would be an example of some plausible path where the API does end up being shared. But even if they don't end up being shared, I think that there's no harm necessarily living in the namespace, especially if it's the same technical scope. And the question is whether or not we can come up with that name that does describe the technical scope.
Guy, do you want to take this first, or should I?
Yeah, I guess my sort of viewpoint is like we have a cluster Autoscaling and Karpenter at this point. We have some shared concepts between them, some where they're different, which we have sort of been touched on already. I guess if we were to take the approach of like we only put concepts that the two projects share into the namespace, then effectively we're saying that there's no possibility of a third project coming along at some point. I think it's unlikely, but potentially a third project which has like doesn't share those concepts. So to me, the idea of that shared namespace being extensible with concepts that the projects can, as needed, choose which of them they make use of, feels like the more neutral option for like not picking winners here.
Could there be something like a spec for this, like we have for Q&I? Because it sounds like your idea seems very similar to that.
I think the idea is slightly different. Like, just to clarify, you said that like the CNI, like the spec for the CNI, I think that's truly aligning around a shared interface. And I think that's the open question, is we don't actually know if there is a shared interface. And we're pretty sure that there's maybe some sharing, but almost certainly other aspects that can't be shared. And so it's less about having a shared interface and more about having a shared namespace or shared, like as a user, as you're thinking, like what part of the Kubernetes landscape is this? Is this a, what is the like, presumably we see this all the time, customers migrating from CAS to Karpenter and Karpenter to CAS. And they're still solving the same problems. And does that deserve to be within the same scope? So it's more of a concept.
I guess what I was trying to get at is when I said CNI spec, what I meant is like a shared standard maybe, and not necessarily how things should behave internally, but just some common interfaces, of like namespace, some common standards, so to say.
Yeah, so from my side, I don't think having two completely different APIs in the same namespace really makes it any more, like it doesn't make it any easier for the user. Honestly, like, I mean, when I put a CRD, I just copy it from somewhere. It doesn't really make that much change. I mean, I guess you could say, that you can have a shared RBAC, but that's so, I think, marginal in terms of effort. So I don't see that as something that really like helps the users. I agree that the scope is different, and so the API cannot, like realistically, it's not going to be the same for everything, if nothing else, because of the Karpenter does things that Cluster Autoscaler does not, and we'll need an API for this. That much is obvious. What I'd like to propose is basically to at least put some time to try to figure out if there is a shared part that we can do. I think basically if we say the auto-scaling part, let's say scale down of the consolidation, I don't know if this can be unified, but it's at least plausible to consider. Maybe we can put something shared for this. Like I'm not saying separate CRD for everything, but like the auto-scaling part, maybe we can standardize on and then put into the same API space the kind of provisioning part. Because at that point, it feels like there is one API for provisioning, one for auto-scaling. Sure, the provisioning one is only supported by Karpenter because it's out of scope. But at least for the relevant parts, we made the effort to standardize. I think, maybe it doesn't work, but I think it would be worth at least giving it an honest attempt and seeing if it's something we are able to accomplish.
Machine
think-
theory is maybe a good example to test that theory. So for example, you could imagine a cluster autoscaler provider that is essentially the implementation is using machines. And so you have like your root machine of the group. And then to add a new, to do the scale up, to increase the replica count, you just copy the machine spec, you give it a new name, and you just make another copy. And to scale down, you just choose which machine do we want to terminate, and you delete that one. And you maybe use some sort of label scheming to do different types of groups. In that sense, that's an API that both Karpenter and Cast, that primitive, can be used to launch and terminate nodes. Karpenter, I guess, would be more flexible about the exact configuration of what it does with that and maybe take additional actions on those instances more than just scale up and scale down or actions on those machines. But from that perspective, does the machine make sense to live in this kind of new SIG autoscaling, or, you know, for lack of a better term, like node lifecycle namespace within the Kubernetes suffix?
Possibly. I think your argument makes sense, but also I would like to you know, read the API in more detail and have a look at this so with some, let's say, review. You could definitely make cluster autoscaler cloud provider integration that uses a lot of those Karpenter concepts, but I see a lot of shared concepts that are just done slightly differently. Like, for example, startup taints exist in both cluster autoscaler and Karpenter. It's just in cluster autoscaler, you do this with either flag or prefix on the name of taint. Those are all things that we could very reasonably figure out a way to like to just have one way of doing the same thing. Really. Like the concept, I believe, is the same. I mean, I only know there's startup taints in Karpenter, and I just assume it's the same as in cluster autoscaler.
It is.
There is a lot of, I think, examples, or at least some examples, and I think we should explore this.
Right. I think the question here is when we choose a API group name between one and two, what is the scope of that? If when I say scope, what I mean is, do we want to use that only for common concepts like common labels, which behave similarly but have different names right now in Karpenter or cluster autoscaler? Or is this more like, you know, common functionality also, which goes a step further?
Are you saying, like, is it the union of Karpenter and cluster autoscaler, or is it the intersection of Karpenter and cluster autoscaler?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So based on that, I think a lot of things would change, right? If this is a union, then if we go with one or two, we would have to look for potential naming conflicts between both of them. In the sense that today we have node pool in Karpenter and we have node group in cluster autoscaler, we would have to rename them, and then we'd have to somehow make them somewhat similar, at least from user perspective. So union might be a little difficult. So I guess the question would be, are we going for the intersection and saying either one or two would be an intersection of both of them, like do not evict label, for example, and just use the label for that.
So what I would propose is a shared API for the intersection. Again, as much as we can make it work. Whether we put, I think putting the union in the same namespace makes sense to me, as long as we just don't copy the existing API sort of as is without trying to get the intersection to be more portable. I wouldn't also mind intersection. Like I don't have very strong opinion on this. I don't know what other people in the group think. Like I think both approaches make sense, honestly. Like both just limiting ourselves to intersection and also supporting the whole union, just in a way where one functionality gets kind of one API.
Right. As a user, what I'd like is if I'm using a particular label cluster autoscaler, and if Karpenter is doing something very similar, if I can use the same label, it's less overhead for me. But then if the expectation is different, then it's also a source of confusion.
Yeah, I guess the tricky part about intersection is then we need two new concepts. To like you have the union concept and then, or not the union, you have the intersection concept, and then you have the cluster autoscaler alone concept, like the cluster-autoscaler.kubernetes.io, and then the Karpenter only concept. So we would then need a cap for two new .kubernetes.io namespaces, unless we decided that the Karpenter only concept shouldn't live in the Kubernetes .io. Like that seems kind of it starts to open up a bunch of like questions to me that it seems like complicate things and also potentially make things more like the user just needs to keep track of more things at that point. And like,
yeah, and
we find this regularly with like topology.kubernetes.io when customers are trying to set node labels. Like every single node label is node.io, and then if you want to set zone, it's topology.node.io, and we implemented like a fuzzy finder in our code to give helpful user errors in that case. But it's just an example of like, as the more domains that exist from the user's perspective, it's just more things to get wrong.
Right. And I think the second thing here would be we'd have to name our domain in such a way that it is not confused with kubelet or cluster API. Because if you use something like compute.kubernetes.io, I guess as a user, my question would be, if someone asked me, who do you think uses this label? And I would think this might be cluster API, this might be kubelet, or this might be a cluster autoscaler. And if someone asked me about one, my question would be, is this cluster autoscaler? Or is this horizontal pod autoscaler, or this vertical pod autoscaler? So I think making the name a little specific, like yeah, the third option, for example, node lifecycle, for example. Even this, I think if you ask me as a user, I would think, is this cluster API, or is this cluster autoscaling, or Karpenter, for example?
Yeah, raise your hand up for a reason.
It was just jumping back a bit. I think the other challenge, if we went for the only doing consistent, like common concepts between them, would be if one of the projects then starts do it that currently doesn't do one of the things, say cluster autoscaler started doing consolidation, like we'd then have the pain of then trying to move those APIs into the original shared group, etc. And obviously, if we start adding entirely new behaviors, we will have that. But I think it just leads to. I agree with the general point of like it leads to more things, the user needing to care about more things, which I think is generally what we're all saying we're trying to avoid here.
I think if you're going for an intersection, you would have to also define what the user should expect and the implementation.
So based on the discussion, my thoughts here would be, I think it's reasonable to say that the entire functionality that sort of makes sense under the given namespace could fit. So if we say it's node lifecycle, I think having both provisioning and auto-scaling related concepts, and even things like node upgrade related concepts potentially, as just one additional example, would make sense to have like some sort of common API for all of those, even if not every project in the space supports all of them. I think that's okay. Like there is 3 APIs, let's say, so and then every project is free to support whatever it wants. If a project wants to make its own extensions in a private namespace, that's obviously, any project is always free to do that. So I guess projects would be able to do that if they want to, but yeah, I think putting everything in a node lifecycle makes a lot of sense to me. Oh, a different name, by the way. I just happen to like the node lifecycle as a descriptive one, but
yeah, I think I'm hearing from this discussion that there's an AI to do a little bit of work, shared work on Cass and Karpenter's side to figure out what these shared concepts are and put together a doc that proposes unifying some concepts as well as putting everything under. It sounds like we're relatively agreed on unifying concepts where it makes sense and kind of creating a namespace where the union of these 2 projects can live inside of. It just sounds like we need to put a document together that describes some of these things. I'm curious what the best forum to do that so that people can share their opinions and give thoughts.
Not directly answering your question. If there is an interest in this group, I am happy to kind of present in a similar way that what you did, the existing API service of Cluster Autoscaler. I think it may be helpful. Again, if there is interest, if there isn't, that's okay. Yeah. I can do that next week during our slot if that works for everyone.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah. Happy to
I have
do that.
a hard stop at 10 a.m. just while we're taking AIs. Sounds like we have an AI to do a deep dive on the Cluster Autoscaler API surface, and that'll help us get more clarity on this question. I'd also love for us to charge forward as fast as we can on some of this upstream discussion, because I know how long some of these things can take, so the earlier we start, the better. Maciek or Guy, would you guys be willing to help shepherd that and accelerate that for us with the API standards group, just to what are your thoughts on how we can make progress on that? I think concretely we probably don't want to block our beta on the API group, and we'll keep our beta in the current API group, but 3 months from now or however long, I'd love to get to closure on this.
Yeah, agreed on not blocking it. Happy to sync up on Slack and start figuring out those discussions. One thing that just sort of popped into my head is we probably want to, and I can't even remember what SIG it lives under now, but if we're talking about involving those sorts of operations of descheduling, then probably the maintainers of descheduler as well, get them involved in discussions. But yeah, let's sync on Slack and get the ball moving on that this week rather than wait until next meeting.
You mentioned there is some process that is not quite CAP but similar. Can you share a link maybe on Slack or here or in the meeting agenda?
Yeah, it's API review process. I've linked it in the meeting notes, but I've linked it in the Zoom chat, but I'll stick it in the meeting notes as well.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I missed that. My bad.
Yeah, no worries.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Cool. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
No, thanks, everyone.